Today, we're talking to Haley Moss. She's a public speaker, she's an attorney, and an author and advocate for people who are neurodivergent, and she has autism. One of the most phenomenal people I have ever met. If you think that you are a little neurodiverse and you want to know how to navigate law school and how to be a really good advocate for yourself, then you want to make sure you are listening to this particular episode. We're going to tackle a lot of great subjects and you're going to learn an awful lot. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Break into Law School. I'm your host, Lavetta Jenkins. Welcome, Haley. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listen, I know that I'm going to enjoy this conversation so much. So, you are an author of a book, and I'm going to read the title. It is Great Minds Think Differently: Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals. First of all, I must say, love the title because neurodiversity is a subject we don't often talk about.
Mhm.
You do mention that you were diagnosed with autism at the age of 3. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Okay, this seems like a buckle up and strap in to have this
Yes.
conversation. You
Yes.
did mention that I was diagnosed as a kid, so I am
Mhm.
a 90s baby, which means when I was diagnosed, we were talking a little bit about a slightly different world where, dial up internet was still a thing, the Backstreet Boys were still cool, all of that jazz. And I say this very deliberately because usually we think about, oh, you suspect a kid is autistic, we're just going to turn to Google. It was not like that when I was a kid, that my parents didn't really know what was going on because I was originally a late speaker, so I wasn't talking when I was first diagnosed. I was kicked out of preschool. I was doing great big jigsaw puzzles and reading and doing other things, but I couldn't really speak. So it was very obvious and evident that there was something going on. And originally, I think they may have thought that I was deaf or that I was gifted because I clearly wasn't responding, I wasn't talking. And autism came as a shock that it wasn't something my parents were really prepared for. Again, the popular knowledge of autism as well was very different. Is we didn't have characters, we didn't have shows on Netflix like Love on the Spectrum, we didn't have the same mainstream conversations that we have today. So the way that autism was talked about and in the common culture was very, very different. Needless to say, I think it's pretty obvious by this point that I'm fairly verbal. So today I always describe myself as an attorney by trade and an educator by choice because I love getting to teach people about neurodiversity and autism and doing our part to make things in our society and professional culture, especially be more accepting and inclusive of not just autistic people, but all neurodivergent and disabled individuals. I am the author of several books. You did mention one of my books. I want to be able to help other neurodivergent and disabled people whenever I can. I have so much faith and love for this community. I also am an artist and I love getting to advocate. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know how much we want to really go through. I know we just touched on the fact that yes, I did indeed survive law school because I am an attorney.
That's good. So I want to dig a little bit more into that because you were diagnosed at 3. You said preschool was really rough, and I was a preschool teacher before,
Mhm.
in the early 2000s. So I know all about what testing and everything we had then. But because you were there in the 90s before all of these tests came to be,
Mhm.
I know it had to have been a little bit of a jar for yourself, your parents, and your teacher as well. How was school, elementary school and high school and undergrad for you?
Okay. So I always say I was a very happy kid. So that's a good thing. I was out of receiving special education services once my parents put me in private school in kindergarten ish,
Okay.
I believe. I want to make sure I get that right. I should know this stuff about my own
Okay.
history, but somehow it's always like, oh, you know how it is with your early life that you're not really the best historian.
Oh yeah, that was a long time ago.
And also,
Yes.
you don't remember being like 5 years old that well. But I was always very happy. All of my friends were boys because I played video games and Pokemon and collected Yu Gi Oh cards and Pokemon cards with all of them. Fun fact, I still collect Pokemon cards. So, all my friends as a youngster were all boys because I didn't have the social skills for the girls and my interests did not align with theirs. It wasn't until probably about high school that I feel like things really changed for me and not always in the best way. So, I was excluded a lot from, especially with the other girls. My interests were still kind of off the beaten path, and I was also masking a lot more. So I was really trying to fit in, trying to seem more quote unquote normal in some way, even though I don't think anything is normal at this point. I genuinely just don't understand the concept of normal. It just doesn't make sense to me. But let me think of what else I can share about this whole point of my in time. I was good at school. I was good at school. That's the thing that most you gotta kinda get lost that gets lost in this as well, is that I was good at school, meaning that I got good grades. I was not pegged as a problem kid, especially even though if I was very anxious and quiet and people and socializing was extremely difficult for me and I didn't have a lot of friends, nobody really thought too much of it because I was good at school. I got good grades, and I think that's what's true for a lot of marginalized neurodivergent people, that if you are, especially if you're female or gender diverse or some other form of marginalized, as long as you get good grades, you are not viewed as someone who has issues and therefore don't really need support. I think that happens to a lot of us, but it's when you have either very disruptive behavior or your grades are bad that you're suddenly a problem who needs to receive assistance and help and accommodations and whatnot. So I feel like there's sort of two things that happen. You're either exceptional or you are pitied. You don't really get to be an average person. And I think that especially not just with neurodivergent youth when we talk about kids in school, but even as an adult, like you have to be either a superstar or everybody feels bad for you. And I'm like, I don't want you to feel bad for me. And I feel like I have put so much pressure on myself, or that there's a lot of societal pressure as well to be a superstar essentially. Of, oh, I did all the things. I worked super hard in law school. I joined all the clubs. I served on all the executive boards. I did all the things. I had the perfect internship. I did everything so by the book to get the same opportunities as everybody else. And it left me feeling exhausted, which should surprise absolutely nobody.
So that's one thing that you just said. Like you struggle to do, not even struggle, but you feel like you have to do all of the things just for
Mhm.
people to see you as somewhat quote unquote normal. And normal isn't a word that I use often because,
Normal.
like you said, what is normal?
I wouldn't
That
even say it's seeing me as normal so much as giving me the perception of competence. Like
mhm,
the best way to have this described, I think, is that I have to prove that I am competent, while
right.
other people have the presumption of competence already.
Ooh, Haley, that was a good one. I love it's almost like, in the court of law, we are, innocent until proven guilty. You've got to prove your competence to everybody when somebody would just look at somebody else and be like, "Oh yeah, they can do it. They're fine."
Mhm.
That in itself can cause you to have pressure on yourself
Yeah.
because now you've always got to prove yourself. You have to
Mhm.
be top. You have to make
Oh,
sure that
yeah.
you come in. If I'm going to do it, then I have to be the absolute best at it. And I think that that's not only something that a lot of neurodiverse people feel, but those who are under a lot of
Mhm.
pressure to succeed feel that as well. Hmm. I think that there's something else here that we can probably get into
Mhm.
simply because you said, you were good in school. To
Mhm.
us, good in school, like you said, is either, I'm doing my grades, I'm making sure my grades are good, and I'm quiet and I'm staying on task as much as possible.
That was
And
me.
nobody really sees that there's an issue unless you are disruptive. Now, in my case, I was talking all the time. Surprise, surprise. But in some other cases, you'll catch children, with a behavior issue, and you mix that with a little bit of neurodiversity, and then they really want to like throw all the services at you and everything, when it really is that maybe sometimes they just need a little bit of different support, or they're done with their work and they're bored and need something else to do.
I was also bored.
Yeah. I
I
get
needed
bored a lot.
I feel like I always needed the intellectual stimulation, and that's also
Hmm.
partly why I think law school was so great in that regard. Because you definitely weren't sitting there bored.
No, not in law
Some
school.
of
I
my
hear you.
professors, admittedly, were a little bit dry, but that
Mm,
doesn't mean I was bored with the material.
right. As long as you've got good material, you can do it. So how did you even get into law? What made you decide to be a lawyer?
I decided to go to law school when I was an undergrad, so I was maybe 6 weeks into undergrad. I thought I was gonna be a doctor because I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I did not understand how people operate and how people think, and I thought the best way to understand that was to understand and learn the intricacies of the human brain and be able to help people with their problems. I thought that would be the coolest thing possible, and I realized very, very quickly it took 6 weeks of being pre-med to realize I hated the sciences, and that was not my passion. Shocker. I know. I know. I failed at the autistic stereotype of being a STEM genius. But I had to think about what did I actually want to do with my life and what did I enjoy. And I love to write, I love to read, I love to research, and I like to talk to people and help people. It turns out that lawyers do all of those things, and that's how I decided I'm going to go to law school.
So you went to law school. Were there any type of accommodations made for you when you were test taking or when you were studying? Did you kind of modify anything? How did you manage that?
I feel like I self accommodated my way through law school because, fun fact, my law school
Okay.
denied my accommodations requests. We can be here all day long talking about how difficult it is to navigate the accommodation systems that are in play in academia. But I self accommodated with other people's notes. I self accommodated with how I did the reading, with what I was willing to learn, how I was going to learn, how I was modifying and putting my schedule together because I wasn't getting that formal support through my university. So having to do that myself was a lot. So, and I didn't receive accommodations on the standardized tests. So there are many reasons in different political systems and whatnot as to why receiving accommodations on something like the LSAT was not an option for me. It's not because I didn't have documentation or anything like that, but at the time, test scores that were taken with extra time or something like that were flagged. And admissions officers knew that meant you had a disability. And I didn't feel comfortable with them knowing that information because of that, or thinking that perhaps that score was not justified or something like that. Like, I didn't want to deal with that. That practice has since ended. It ended with a major settlement between LSAC and other civil rights organizations that was multi-million dollar payout, lots of interesting things that went along with that. I wrote about it when I was in law school, so it's something I'm very passionate and interested in about. So if you ask me to talk about testing bias and discrimination for people with disabilities, I think it's fascinating. We can have a whole sidebar conversation on that. So that is partly why I did not go that direction. And of course, when you go to take something like the bar, they want to know your prior history of accommodations on standardized tests and what you got in law school. And I had goose egg to show for it. So I did not bother with the accommodations process at that point. And looking back, I regret that. I wish I knew how to advocate for myself a little bit better. And I think there's some grace that you have to learn to extend towards yourself in that journey, because you have to remember something else about me going to law school. I was young. I entered law school over my 21st birthday. I did not know how many 21-year-olds know how to advocate for themselves. How many of them know how to navigate a system that is complex and that you need almost lawyer level advocacy skills to navigate while you are learning to become a lawyer. And not only that, you're younger than everybody around you. So I'm learning and have learned over the years, the more I look back on that time in my life, to kind of extend grace to my younger self, because there's no way that I think I would have possibly have had the skill set that I look back and think, well, you should have had that at 21, 22, 23.
Hmm. I love that you said you have to learn how to advocate for yourself because I think that's something that a lot of people always learn, but we learn it a little too late sometimes. So anytime we can give somebody a heads up, I always like to do so. Even if you're not what we would call neurodivergent, even if you are sort of what they call atypical, always make sure you know to stand up for yourself. If you're not feeling right about a situation, or if you feel like something is a little bit biased against you, always stick up for yourself because at the end of the day, you have to live with you and the decisions that you have made or that were made for you.
Oh, 100%. And I also think there comes a time that you can't always be expected to advocate for yourself because you will burn out on it, which is why I think these conversations like we're having now are so important. So then the neurotypical people listening can help us advocate and advocate with us rather than making the whole burden of advocating for ourselves be a constant push and pull.
So, Haley, I got to ask you the question that I know you've probably been asked 1,000 times before, simply because I know everybody's going to wonder. You
Mhm.
didn't have any accommodations for high school, well, for undergrad and for law school. Did you have any accommodations when you took the bar? Anything special?
I did not. I think I mentioned that I did not go through the bar exam accommodations process
Cool.
primarily because I was denied that history when I was in law school, and I what I was offered in college was not stuff I actually needed as well. So college offered me extra time on tests, which was never something that would have been helpful to me. And of course, I declined it because of that.
Mhm.
I didn't get accommodations in law school, and I chose not to go through the entire paperwork mess that would have been trying to get accommodations on the bar exam, so I did not.
Right. Yeah, and I think that that speaks volumes as well because trying to even get accommodations, you have to jump through several hoops, and I'm quite
It's a
sure
circus.
at least 20 pages of paperwork trying to make sure you
It's
get
so
just what's
much.
due you.
It's so much work. There's such a burden on disabled test takers and students to do that. And it's because there's such kind of stigma around accommodations that there's some
Hmm.
kind of unfair advantage. Usually, the other thing that happens if I tell you that I didn't get accommodations, I've literally been asked if I've gotten to take an easier version of the bar, which I did not.
What?
And then, of course, if when people ask if I got accommodations like you did, they
Hmm.
usually use that to try to invalidate the fact that I passed. Is, oh, you had some kind of unfair advantage when you took the bar. And it's like, no, and I passed the bar on my first try, which I'm extremely grateful for. I've had many, many
Congratulations.
nightmares about the bar exam. I still do have nightmares about the bar exam. I'm very honest about that.
Hmm.
But it's not like some kind of badge of honor or something that I
Hmm.
passed on the first try despite not getting accommodations. That
Right.
the fact is that the process to even get to that point has failed me, that I couldn't get the
Hmm.
support that I needed. I know I
Right.
would have had a much easier and better and less anxiety inducing time taking the bar exam had I gotten to take it in the private rooms as were
Hmm.
offered accommodations
Hmm.
instead of taking it in a convention center room with 2,000 people at the same time. And that made
Oh.
my anxiety on high. I remember my anxiety being on high because I was scared that like I had the wrong type of jacket, that they would think I was smuggling something into the room or something. Like
Mm.
my anxiety was such at a high taking that test. I remember wanting to give up halfway through.
Oh.
And my mom and I met for lunch, and she said, "You're going back in there. You made it through a day and a half of this, and it's 2 8 hour days." She's like, "You're going back in there and finishing it." And I was like, "Yes, I am. Thank you. Like, thank you for this pep talk and lunch. I needed that." And then I cried the whole way home because it was
But
a
I'm
lot.
so glad you stuck with it. I'm so glad you stuck with
Me
it and
too.
that you crushed it, doing it that next day. I
And I
do
also want to
feel.
be clear that that system has failed so many amazing people because it's a test that doesn't measure how good of a
Hmm.
lawyer you're going to be. It doesn't measure what you've actually learned in law school. It doesn't
Yeah.
measure what professional competence you do or don't have. It
Hmm.
doesn't tell, I don't know what exactly the bar exam is supposed to say. I
Hmm.
don't know what the perfect alternative to it is. I think practical experience would be infinitely better because there's a bunch of lawyers have
Hmm.
who can pass the bar exam and have no business interacting with clients, because it's not like you learn how to interact with people. It's not like you learn how to have empathy or trauma informed care or literally anything that would make you a good lawyer, or
Mm.
research skills or written skills or oral advocacy skills. You don't get anything out of the bar except your ability to recite a bunch of
Right.
random facts and write an essay in a very formulaic way. So I don't really know how that quite measures what we want it to measure, and say go forth
Exactly.
and do good in the world and be a zealous advocate for others, whether they are people, corporations, dogs, or what have you, because you still in so many ways can affect the outcome of somebody's life.
Mm. I feel like there's so much to be said by people who just assume, like you said, assume that you had, accommodations, assume that you took a different version. Just because you are neurodiverse does not mean you cannot learn. Sometimes you learn differently. And that is what makes every single person beautiful in their own right. Just because, I like systems and routines doesn't mean that I won't be able to learn the exact same material as somebody who doesn't need everything in a system and a schedule and a routine. Just because I don't like my schedule being, abruptly changed doesn't mean that I can't do the same exact thing that somebody else with a same or similar job could do. I think that that's a misconception that the world has about people who are neurodiverse.
Oh, for sure. And I think there's just such a misunderstanding of what neurodiversity is, and that neurodivergent people are, again, human, and that I think something else that happens is the things that are very difficult for me, like you talk about needing routine and schedule and all of this stuff. People often think the things that make my life more difficult are not the things that actually make my life difficult, or that the disability related stuff is the stuff that rules my world. And it really doesn't. A lot of it is minor and major inconveniences, but it does not rule my world. It is not the sun, moon, and the stars. It might be a couple stars or a spare asteroid now and then. Sometimes that asteroid might hit a planet, but most of the time it's just space junk floating around in there, and it's not the sun, the moon, and the stars. The sun, the moon, and the stars are the things that are the same sun, moon, and stars that we all see. The fact we want opportunities and careers and love and family and a roof over our head and our hobbies and our dreams. Like we all have that same solar system almost, or at least the core tenets of that solar system that make us human. It's just that there's a lot of extra space junk floating around that sometimes can crash into those other things. That's the best way I can describe it right now, which I've never described it that way, but now that I am, like, kind of makes sense.
That was pretty good. I like that, Haley. We were talking a little bit before the podcast about people who are neurodivergent, and sometimes you have to go and do things that are a little uncomfortable for you. And you brought up something that was super smart. And I could not have even almost thought of this type of analogy. But you said that it was like just you being yourself, but with the volume turned up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something so many neurodivergent people do because there's such a misunderstanding that we have to almost adapt constantly and change parts of ourselves or camouflage parts of ourselves in order to fit in. A lot of the experience, I think I was telling you as well, is almost like playing a different version of yourself and cosplaying essentially in so many ways. I usually explain this to the neurotypicals as if they've ever worked a customer service or a restaurant job and they've had to smile and the customers are kind of being the worst. And they're like, everything is fine, ma'am. We'll take care of it. And inside you're thinking, I hate you right now. You are such a jerk. And you're just sitting there like, everything's going to be fine. No problem whatsoever. And then you come home and you want to scream. Except imagine doing that all the time, not just for your 8-hour shift. Is that's kind of sometimes what the experience feels like is so much of neurodivergent masking in particular and camouflaging, which is when you do take on that persona that feels more neurotypical to gain that social acceptance. And it's something a lot of women, gender diverse, and people of color especially do in order to survive essentially. It just leaves you feeling exhausted. And it leads to so many folks not getting support, not getting a diagnosis, just so many ways that this world continues to fail neurodivergent people and it leaves us feeling burned out.
Yeah, and that's what we all want to avoid is burn out. Now, I know somewhere there's somebody who is as we would say, differently abled or neurodivergent, who's really thinking like, wow, maybe I want to do that too. What advice would you give someone who wants to probably follow in your footsteps?
The first piece of advice I would give you is to stay true to yourself when you want to follow in your footsteps because there's only one you.
Mhm.
Because there's people who have said like I'm following in XYZ's footsteps or that I'm the next so and so, and I'm like, no, I'm the first Haley Moss. Like that's always been kind of my attitude about it. So stay true to yourself. That's the first thing I want to tell you. Like you might not want to be the next me or something. You want to be the first you. And I love that for you. That's what I want for you. And I say that with nothing but love. I think you can learn from so many amazing people. If you do learn something from me, I am beyond grateful and it really genuinely means a lot to me. But I really want you to be you. And it's very difficult in the fact that sometimes the world doesn't want you to be you because there's all these societal expectations and unwritten rules that you're somehow expected to just know the answers to, and that the world isn't necessarily built with neurodivergent people in mind. But there is a community of people out there who get it, who love you, who understand you, and are cheering for you. So I hope that you find your people and do what feels best for you. And it's okay if you don't have that figured out right away. You don't have to have all the answers.
I wish somebody would have told, 20-year-old me, you don't have to have it all figured out now, because I think a lot of people get out of high
Mm-hmm.
school, do undergrad, and they think, okay, I have to hurry up and figure everything out by the time I'm 25. And that is not so. You figure things out on your
Mm-hmm.
own time. And when it's time for you to do whatever it is you need to do, it will happen. And the more we can kind of drive that home to people, I think the better off the world will
Mm-hmm.
be.
And I think we also have to do better because how many of us encounter people who are older than us and think they have it all together and they really don't? Like my 20-year-old me would have benefited from knowing you don't have to have it figured out. Almost 30-year-old me would benefit from knowing, hey, it's okay that you don't have the answer to every single thing or that things aren't on this very specific timeline that it looks like everybody else around you is on. And I promise that everyone else who looks like they have it figured it out, they probably don't have it as figured out as they think they do. And that's something I learned especially in law school because when you're around first year law students, they think they know everything. You get a lot of know-it-alls and smart alecks in the room, okay? And then you realize very quickly they're just bluffing. They don't know the things that they think they know. That you're sitting there like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know this. And the sooner I realized that, the better I felt. Not because I knew nothing. I came into law school barely knowing. I was not a political science major. I was very embarrassed that there was a point in my law school career that I did not realize that there was some sort of distinction between certain state things and certain federal things. Like there was a point where I had a light bulb moment of, oh, this is state versus federal. I'm pretty sure that took at least 2 to 3 weeks to figure out, and I'm not proud of that. But I am very honest about it with you because so often law students think they know everything. And the sooner you have the humility to realize you don't have it all figured out, and also the honesty with everyone around you to realize, hey, that's okay, because deep down, none of us know what we're doing. Most of us don't have it figured out. We don't know what our career is. We don't know what's written in the stars. We can't predict the future. None of us have a crystal ball. And there's something really beautiful about that. And it's something I wish more people were honest about.
Yeah, I love that, Haley. You have been such an amazing guest. Tell our listeners and viewers how they can find out more about you, the services you offer, and all about your public speaking.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about neurodiversity, if you want to learn more about autism, you want to buy my books, you want to do any of that stuff, you are more than welcome to follow me and connect with me however you feel most comfortable. I have a website at haleymoss.com and I am very much online. I am painfully a millennial, which means I am on all major social media. So you can say hello to me on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. You can say hi to me however you feel most comfortable. And I'm excited to get to connect with y'all further. I mean, I think there's so many great conversations we can have as far as making things more inclusive and accessible, not just for lawyers and law students, but everybody.
But all the professionals, just like you said in your book. Haley, thank you so much for being my guest today. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.